next up is Kento Morita, and this is Lost in Translation 2, Electric Boogaloo.
Hello, how's it going? So, when I was 6 years old, being a Japanese kid, my parents' word was the law, you know. And it was May, first grade was over, finally, and my parents, after dinner, told me that they had a huge announcement to make. And I was like, okay, that's cool. And then they told me, you're gonna go on an adventure. You're gonna go to Okinawa, Japan for 3 months, where my grandparents are. And I was like, okay. And then they were like, and the Japanese school system is different. They start in April, you Americans start in September. Long story short, you're gonna get to go to school there. Okay. And then they were like, and this is such a rare opportunity. No other kid gets this. You're gonna go on your own. I was like, what? And I think it's like when kids, you know, when they scrape their knee or something, and they're kind of looking around to see whether like they're supposed to cry, and then the parents are like, it's great! And then the kid is like, that's what was happening to me. And I was like, and they're like, see, it's great. This is a great idea. You should go. I got on the plane. I went to Okinawa for 3 months, and I didn't hear from my parents for 3 months. And I did not let it show that I was lonely, because they told me that this was a rare opportunity for me to show that I'm an independent, strong boy. Then that happened for the next 10 years. So when people ask me where we're born and raised, I honestly say I was half raised in Japan and half raised in the US. And finally, I was 16 and I wanted an American summer for the first time in my life. So I prepared an entire presentation for my parents. I was like, okay, I know what they might say, so I came up with some counter arguments. And I basically was like, okay, in 2 years, I'm gonna have to apply to colleges. And colleges love extracurriculars. And I played a trumpet, so maybe I could join the marching band. And they were like, okay. And I was like, I got it. Marching band practices during the summer in the US. So I gotta stay here. And finally got to stay in the US. I visited my grandparents less frequently after that. I went back once during college, once after I got a job. Then I got a job with a Japanese company, so I was able to go back maybe once a year. But then 2020 hit, the COVID pandemic, and my grandmother passed. And I couldn't go back to pay my respects. Tony Hawk was there, talking about the Olympics and on skateboarding stuff. I can go, you know. And it's like, it sucks. And then 3 years later, my grandfather passed, and I was able to go pay my respects. An Okinawan funeral is very, very physically intimate. The casket is open during the wake. There are beds next to the casket. You're allowed to sleep in the same room while the body's in viewing. You don't want to leave him alone. My great uncle showed me how you would place flowers around his head. You touched their head, the hands. I noticed how his broad shoulders were now very skinny. He also showed me that you put snacks that he liked with him. So when he gets cremated, he has some snacks for the road. He even put some cigarettes in there, and I was like, wait, my grandpa doesn't smoke. And he was like, well, you didn't know your grandpa that well. He used to smoke. When I was born, he quit. And but he was like, it's really for your great-grandfather. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, do you think it's going to be great if he goes there empty-handed? So it's a gift for my great-grandparents. Then the day of the cremation came, and we put the casket onto this big, heavy cart. And then we roll the cart into the furnace room. The furnace doors close, and we're in the waiting room, and 30 minutes later, the cart comes back out, and it's piping hot. You could feel the heat from 10 feet away. And no longer are the cigarettes, no longer are the flowers or the snacks, only the bones are on the cart. And then we do what is called a hashiwatashi ceremony, where 3 people, including myself, I was chosen as one of the 3, stand, if there's a casket here, on either side of the casket. And you take these chopsticks, one made out of bamboo, one made out of wood, and you pick up the bones. And they're very light. They're very fragile. And what you do is you pass the bones from chopstick to chopstick. Then they pass it over to the third person, who was my mom, and then they put it into the urn. The number 3 is san, and the river Styx is the Sanzu no Kawa. So there's a pun element to that. And hashiwatashi literally means bridge and crossing, but it also means hashi is also chopstick and handing off. So there's a lot of meaning there. And after the ceremony, I really felt at peace. I saw the same ceremony through Zoom when my grandmother passed. But there's still a part of me that still thinks she's around. There's no finality to that. I'm still working through that. But this very physically intimate ceremony really brought me at peace with my grandfather's passing. We went back to my grandparents' home at the living room. We were having dinner, my parents and I. And I realized that this was the first time I've ever seen my parents in that room. And my mom and I started to talk about my grandfather, her father. And she said, not a lot of Japanese people get to do the hashiwatashi. That was a rare opportunity. And that phrase just conjured up my memories of feeling so alone in that room, missing those 2 people who were right in front of me so dearly. And, the word rare opportunity, it was a rare opportunity for me to feel so lonely when I was 6 years old. And she was right. It was a rare opportunity for me to be part of that ceremony, and I'll cherish that memory forever. But then I also realized that this was a rare opportunity. I would never want to imply to my parents that they did any less than a perfect job of raising me. It's just a matter of respect. But in that moment, I didn't have a presentation prepared. And I told them, 20-something years ago, when I came here alone for 3 months, I felt very lonely. And as expected, they got very defensive. They said, no, it's great. Not a lot of kids get to do that, go to school all year. And I was like, no, and then my aunt, who was packing up in the other room, overheard the conversation, and she came through the door and she said to my mom, hey, big sis, I think you should listen to your son. He's not pointing fingers, he's just sharing how he feels. And then finally, my parents calmed down and they listened to me. And I like to think that my grandfather, that was his final gift to us. To give us this moment for my parents to be there, my aunt had to be there, I had to be there in that living room to have that conversation. And it also struck me that just because it's a rare opportunity doesn't mean it's a precious one. Rare opportunities could be good or bad. But I think also the flip side is true. I think mundane times could mean the world to you. For instance, when I was 6 years old, I think all I wanted was a boring summer vacation filled with, I don't know, tagging along with my mom to Costco. That's what I wanted, but instead I had this adventure thousands of miles away, feeling pretty lonely. But I want to say I feel proud and I cherish all those rare opportunities that I was able to have. I feel very grateful. And I like to think that all those moments led us to here. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing this rare opportunity to share this story with you.
Aww.